It was one of those mornings where everything felt just right. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm glow over the city streets. A light breeze carried the faint scent of coffee from a nearby cafe. For the man walking toward the bank, it was shaping up to be another ordinary day, well, as ordinary as life could get for someone who had built a multi-million-dollar tech empire from scratch. This man wasn't your typical customer at the bank. He was a self-made success story, someone who had worked tirelessly to turn his vision into reality. His company employed hundreds of people and had become a household name in Silicon Valley. Yet, despite all his achievements, he still valued the small things: a handshake with an employee, a quick chat with a vendor, or even running personal errands like visiting the bank himself instead of delegating them to assistants. That morning, he had woken up early, gone through emails while sipping his favorite black coffee, and decided to stop by the bank on his way to the office. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. He'd done it countless times before. Today, though, he needed to withdraw a significant amount of cash, $20,000. Not because he was splurging on something extravagant, but because sometimes business required old-school solutions. Whether it was paying contractors up front or handling unexpected expenses, cash still played its part in keeping things running smoothly. As he stepped into the bank, the familiar hum of activity greeted him. There were customers lined up at the counters, some chatting quietly, others scrolling through their phones. Employees moved around efficiently, attending to queries and processing transactions. Everything seemed normal, at least for now. He approached the teller counter, giving a polite nod to the young woman seated behind the glass partition. She looked familiar, probably someone he'd interacted with during previous visits. He handed over his withdrawal slip along with his ID, explaining what he needed. "I'll need $20,000 in cash," he said matter-of-factly, expecting the process to go smoothly. But then something unusual happened. Instead of proceeding with the transaction, the teller hesitated. Her eyes flickered between the paperwork and the man standing in front of her. After a brief pause, she excused herself and disappeared into the back office. At first, he thought, nothing of it. Maybe she was fetching authorization or double-checking details. Banks often had protocols for large withdrawals, after all. So, he waited patiently, leaning slightly against the counter, glancing around the room. What he didn't know yet was that this seemingly routine trip to the bank was about to take a sharp turn. Little did he realize that within minutes, he would find himself caught in a situation that would challenge not just his patience, but also his sense of dignity. As he stood there waiting, oblivious to what was coming next, the atmosphere inside the bank began to shift ever so subtly. Other customers started stealing glances in his direction, curious about why the usually efficient service seemed to have stalled. Unbeknownst to him, these next few moments would leave a lasting impact, not just on him but on everyone involved. The stage was set. What started as a simple errand was about to spiral into an event that would spark conversations far beyond the walls of that bank branch. And when it was all said and done, nothing would be quite the same again. For him, for the bank, and perhaps even for the broader community watching closely from afar. The man waited patiently at the counter, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his leather portfolio. He wasn't one to lose his cool over minor delays. Running a fast-paced tech company meant he was no stranger to waiting, whether it was for funding approvals, product launches, or even late-night conference calls with overseas teams. So when the teller disappeared into the back office, he didn't think much of it. But as the seconds ticked by, something about the situation began to feel off. The usual background noise of the bank, the rustle of papers, the soft clicks of keyboards, the low murmur of conversations seemed to fade into the distance. Other customers were starting to notice too. A few glanced curiously in his direction, while others whispered behind cupped hands. It wasn't hard to pick up on their reactions. There was a mix of curiosity and unease in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the teller reappeared, but she wasn't alone. Following closely behind her was a middle-aged man wearing a suit that looked slightly too tight around the shoulders. His name tag read, Branch Manager. The man's expression was unreadable, but his body language spoke volumes. Stiff posture, arms crossed tightly across his chest, and a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning," the manager said, his tone clipped and formal. "I understand you're requesting a large withdrawal today?" The customer nodded, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I am. $20,000. Is there an issue?" The manager hesitated before responding. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to proceed, glancing down at the clipboard in his hands as if searching for the right words. Then, without making direct eye contact, he dropped the bombshell. "Sir, we're unable to process this request at the moment due to suspicious activity flagged on your account." The room seemed to freeze. The customer blinked, certain he'd misheard. Suspicious activity? On his account? This was the same account linked to a thriving multi-million-dollar business. He paid employees, managed client payments, and handled investments through this very bank. How could they possibly think anything fishy was going on? "I've been banking here for over a decade," he replied slowly, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Can you explain what exactly is suspicious about my account?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "It's just standard procedure, sir. Large withdrawals like this trigger additional scrutiny. We have to ensure everything is above board." Above board? The phrase hit him like a punch to the gut. Was this really happening? Here he was, a successful entrepreneur, someone who had built a reputation for integrity and hard work, and now he was being treated like some kind of criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. If anything, the bank should have bent over backward to accommodate him, not question his legitimacy. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything, but he couldn't let this slide either. "Look," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect. I've never had issues withdrawing funds before." "Why is this suddenly a problem?" The manager opened his mouth to respond but closed it again almost immediately. Whatever rehearsed script he'd prepared clearly wasn't cutting it. Instead, he mumbled something vague about following protocols and needing further investigation. To anyone listening, it sounded hollow, an excuse rather than an explanation. By now, the tension in the room was palpable. Customers who had initially been distracted by their own business were fully tuned into the unfolding drama. Some looked sympathetic, nodding along as if agreeing with the unfairness of the situation. Others wore expressions of discomfort, shifting awkwardly in their seats as though unsure whether to intervene or mind their own business. For the man standing at the counter, the humiliation was mounting. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the way he was being treated. There was no apology, no effort to make things right. Just cold indifference masked by corporate jargon. And worse still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't entirely about policy. If he were honest with himself, he suspected it had more to do with the color of his skin. He thought back to other instances where he'd faced similar treatment, in restaurants, at airports, even during networking events. Each time he'd brushed it off, telling himself it wasn't worth the energy to confront every microaggression. But this was different. This wasn't just a rude comment or a dismissive glance. This was blatant discrimination, plain and simple. As the conversation continued to spiral downward, the man realized he had two choices: walk away quietly and let the bank win, or stand his ground and demand justice. Either way, he knew this moment would stay with him forever. What he didn't know yet was that his decision would send shockwaves far beyond the confines of the bank branch. The clock on the wall ticked steadily onward, marking each passing second with a quiet inevitability. Outside, the world carried on as usual, cars honking, people rushing to appointments, life moving forward without pause. Inside, however, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Every word exchanged between the man and the manager carried weight, every glance from bystanders adding fuel to the fire. Something was brewing, and everyone present could sense it. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the man made a move that no one saw coming. Not the manager, not the tellers, not even the curious onlookers watching from the sidelines. In less than 10 minutes, the entire dynamic of the room would change forever. But for now, all eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, waiting to see what would happen next. The man stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, customers glancing nervously, tellers pretending to be busy, and the manager shifting uncomfortably under the pressure. It was clear that this wasn't going anywhere productive. The more the manager stammered about protocols and investigations, the angrier he felt, not just at the situation, but at the blatant disrespect disguised as policy. He took a step back from the counter, his jaw tightening slightly. There was no point arguing further. It was obvious the manager wasn't going to budge. Or maybe he couldn't. He seemed too trapped in his own rigid interpretation of the rules. Either way, standing there wasn't going to solve anything. But leaving quietly, that wasn't an option either. Not today. Without another word, the man turned and walked out of the bank. The crisp air outside hit him like a wake-up call, snapping him out of the frustration that had been building inside. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, as he gave her instructions. "Call the regional director of this bank. Get me their number now." Then something unexpected happened. Instead of walking away or hopping into his car, he paused. He looked back at the bank's glass doors, where silhouettes of people moved about inside. For a brief second, he thought about all the times he'd trusted this institution, not just with his money, but with his reputation. He thought about how many paychecks had been processed through this branch, how many deals had been finalized, thanks to the funds flowing seamlessly in and out of his accounts. And yet, here he was, being treated like someone who didn't belong. No, he decided. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. With renewed determination, he marched back inside. The room fell silent as he entered again, his presence commanding attention. Employees froze mid-task, customers stopped talking, and even the manager, who had been whispering urgently with another staff member, looked up, startled. Standing tall in the center of the lobby, the man locked eyes with the manager. His voice was steady but carried an authority that silenced any murmurs around him. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not waiting for an answer before continuing. "I run a company that generates millions every year. My business is one of your biggest clients. You profit off my success daily. Yet today, you've chosen to treat me like a stranger, a suspect." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or panic, it was hard to tell. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the room. Some customers nodded subtly, agreeing with the man's words. Others exchanged skeptical glances, wondering if they were witnessing history in the making. But the man wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharp yet controlled. "You talk about protocols, but let's be honest. This isn't about rules. If it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. This is about bias. Plain and simple." The room went completely still. Even the soft hum of keyboards and printers seemed to fade into the background. The manager looked down at his clipboard, unable to meet the man's gaze. Whatever defense he might have prepared crumbled under the weight of those piercing words. And then, without hesitation, the man delivered the final blow. "You're fired." It wasn't shouted or screamed. It was said with such quiet certainty that it left no room for doubt. The words hung in the air like thunder, reverberating through the stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, reality began to sink in. The manager blinked rapidly, his face pale. A few employees exchanged wide-eyed looks, unsure what to do next. One teller reached for the phone, presumably to call someone higher up. Customers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding approvingly. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of shock, awe, and anticipation. 9 minutes. That's all it took, from the moment the withdrawal request was denied to the instant the manager found himself unemployed. 9 minutes that changed everything. As the man turned to leave, he felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Anger, Yes, but also relief. Relief that he hadn't backed down, that he'd stood up for himself when it mattered most. As he pushed open the glass doors and stepped back into the sunlight, he knew this wasn't the end. In fact, it was only the beginning. Word spread quickly. Within hours, social media was ablaze with posts from witnesses who had seen, or claimed, to have seen the confrontation unfold. Videos surfaced, blurry footage captured on cell phones showing snippets of the heated exchange. Hashtags like Draws Respect Black Success and Y'all Banking While Black started trending online. People shared their own stories of discrimination, flooding comment sections with tales of mistreatment at banks, restaurants, airports, and beyond. Journalists scrambled to piece together what had happened. Calls poured in from news outlets eager to hear the man's side of the story. But for now, he stayed silent. Sitting in his car outside the bank, he took a deep breath and allowed himself a moment of reflection. What had just happened wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that even someone at the top of their game could face prejudice simply because of the color of their skin. And if it could happen to him, what about everyone else? What about the single mom trying to cash her paycheck? The college student opening their first savings account? The retiree struggling to access their pension? As he drove away from the bank, the man made a decision. This incident wasn't going to define him. It was going to fuel him. He would use his platform, his influence, to shine a light on the systemic issues that allowed moments like this to happen. Because if change was going to come, it wouldn't start with anger or outrage alone. It would start with action. By the time he arrived, at his office, the wheels were already turning in his mind. He called a meeting with his team explaining what had happened and outlining his plan. Together, they would draft a statement, not just addressing the incident but calling for accountability and reform within the banking industry. They would reach out to advocacy groups, journalists, and policymakers to amplify the message. Most importantly, they would ensure that this moment didn't fade into obscurity. The fallout from the incident was immediate and explosive. By the time the man returned to his office, social media had already turned the story into a wildfire. Videos of the confrontation, blurry phone recordings taken by customers in the bank, were everywhere. The hashtag Banking While Black trended not just locally but nationally. People who had never met him were sharing their own stories of discrimination, flooding comment sections with raw, emotional accounts of being treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Journalists began reaching out almost instantly. News outlets clamored for interviews, eager to get the full story straight from the source. Some framed it as a tale of empowerment, a successful black entrepreneur standing up against institutional bias. Others saw it as a damning indictment of systemic racism within financial institutions. Regardless of the angle, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about one man or one bank anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger. For the man at the center of it all, the attention was overwhelming, but not entirely surprising. He knew how powerful moments like these could be when they resonated with people on a deep, personal level. Still, he didn't want to rush into anything. This wasn't just a PR opportunity, it was a chance to spark real change. So instead of jumping on camera or posting an impulsive statement online, he took a step back. He needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to figure out how best to use his voice. That evening, after hours of meetings with his team, he sat down at his desk and began writing. Not a press release or a tweet, but an op-ed. Something thoughtful, honest, and unfiltered. As the words flowed onto the page, he poured everything into it, his frustration, his anger, his hope for a better future. When he finally hit send, late that night he felt a sense of clarity. Whatever came next, he was ready. The piece ran in The New York Times, 2 days later, and it struck a nerve. In it, he wrote candidly about the humiliation of being denied service, not as a criminal, but as someone whose success should have granted him respect. It wasn't just about me, he emphasized. If I, someone who has achieved so much, can face discrimination at my own bank. Imagine what everyday people endure. This isn't just my fight, it's everyone's fight." The response was overwhelming. Readers flooded the comment section with messages of support, gratitude, and solidarity. Advocacy groups reached out, asking to collaborate. Lawmakers cited his article during debates on racial equity in financial systems. Even celebrities chimed in, amplifying his message to millions of followers across social media platforms. For many, his words became a rallying cry, a reminder that progress required more than hashtags and outrage. It demanded action. Meanwhile, the bank scrambled to contain the damage. Within hours of the story breaking, they issued a public apology, claiming the decision to deny the withdrawal had been based solely on policy and not racial bias. They promised to review their procedures and ensure such incidents wouldn't happen again. But the man wasn't buying it. Apologies were easy, accountability was hard. And until the bank proved otherwise, he refused to let them off the hook. To their credit, the bank did take some steps toward reform. They reinstated the manager temporarily while conducting an internal investigation, though it was clear his position was untenable. Employees whispered among themselves about the chaos unfolding behind closed doors. Customers reported seeing new signs posted around branches promoting diversity and inclusion initiatives. But none of it felt substantial enough. Not yet, anyway. Determined to keep the pressure on, the man launched a non-profit organization aimed at addressing the very issues he'd faced. Its mission was twofold. First, to educate marginalized communities about financial literacy, empowering them to navigate banking systems with confidence. Second, to advocate for systemic changes within financial institutions, pushing for transparency, accountability, and better training to combat implicit biases. He partnered with grassroots organizations, academics, and industry experts to develop programs that would make a tangible difference. Workshops were held in underserved neighborhoods, teaching people how to manage credit scores, secure loans, and build wealth despite systemic barriers. Town halls brought together community members, activists, and policymakers to discuss solutions. Every initiative was designed not just to raise awareness but to drive meaningful action. Through it all, the man remained deeply involved. He attended events, gave speeches, and met with leaders in both the public and private sectors. His message was always the same. Respect shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't depend on your title, your wealth, or your connections. Everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, not as a favor, but as a fundamental right. As weeks turned into months, the impact of his efforts became undeniable. Banks across the country started revisiting their policies, implementing reforms inspired by the conversations he'd sparked. Advocacy groups gained momentum, using his story as a catalyst for broader discussions about race and economics. Even lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at holding financial institutions accountable for discriminatory practices. But perhaps the most profound effect was felt on a personal level. Countless individuals reached out to thank him, not just for shining a light on their struggles, but for giving them hope. Many shared stories of how his actions had inspired them to speak up, to demand better treatment, to believe that change was possible. One woman wrote to say she'd finally walked into a bank without fear after years of avoiding them altogether. Another described how her teenage son had started researching financial literacy, determined to break cycles of poverty in their family. These stories reminded the man why he'd fought so hard in the first place. Yes, he had stood up for himself that day at the bank, but in doing so, he had also stood up for others. For every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy because of the color of their skin. For every community that had been shut out of opportunities simply because the system wasn't built for them. And while the road ahead was long, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Thousands of voices had joined his, amplifying the call for justice and equality. Together, they were building something bigger than any one person, a movement rooted in resilience, courage, and the unshakable belief that dignity was a right, not a privilege. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, the man couldn't help but smile. What had started as a routine trip to the bank had transformed into something extraordinary. It was messy, uncomfortable, and far from perfect. But it was real, and sometimes that was enough. Months had passed since that fateful morning at the bank, but its ripple effects continued to shape lives. Not just the man's, but countless others who had been touched by his story. The incident wasn't just a moment of personal triumph. It became a turning point for communities, institutions, and even industries. It was proof that one person's courage could spark change far beyond what they might imagine. The bank, once a symbol of exclusion and bias in this man's life, underwent significant transformations. Under mounting public pressure and internal scrutiny, they rolled out sweeping reforms. New policies were introduced to address implicit biases among employees, including mandatory diversity training programs led by experts in racial equity. Managers were required to undergo leadership courses focused on empathy and accountability. Even the physical spaces changed. Branches began displaying posters promoting inclusivity, and customer service protocols were rewritten to prioritize respect over rigid adherence to rules. But perhaps the most telling sign of progress came when the regional director personally reached out to the man. In a heartfelt letter, she acknowledged the harm caused not just by that single incident but by years of systemic neglect. She invited him to sit on an advisory board tasked with reshaping the bank's approach to serving marginalized communities. Though he accepted the invitation cautiously, he made it clear, this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about action. For the man himself, the journey transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always been driven, a visionary entrepreneur, with a knack for innovation. But now he carried a deeper sense of purpose. His nonprofit organization grew rapidly, drawing support from donors, volunteers, and advocates across the country. Financial literacy workshops expanded into full-blown community empowerment programs. High school students learned how to budget and save, while adults discovered strategies to rebuild credit or start businesses. The nonprofit also launched a mentorship initiative pairing young Black entrepreneurs with seasoned professionals, creating pipelines of opportunity where none had existed before. His advocacy work took him to stages he never imagined standing on. From packed auditoriums to intimate community centers, he spoke passionately about dignity, equality, and the power of resilience. At one event, a young woman approached him after his speech, tears streaming down her face. "I've been told my whole life that people like me don't belong in places like this," she said, gesturing toward the polished conference hall around them. "But seeing you here, hearing your story, it makes me believe I can do more than survive. I can thrive." Moments like these reminded him why every ounce of effort was worth it. Change wasn't measured in headlines or policy updates alone. It was reflected in the eyes of those who dared to dream bigger, because someone showed them it was possible. Even within his own company, the impact was undeniable. Employees rallied around his mission, organizing volunteer days and fundraising drives to support the nonprofit. Clients and partners joined the cause, embedding principles of fairness and inclusion into their own operations. What started as a personal crusade evolved into a collective movement, fueled by shared values and mutual determination. Of course, challenges remained. Not everyone applauded his efforts. Some critics dismissed him as attention-seeking, accusing him of exploiting the situation for publicity. Others argued that systemic racism couldn't be dismantled through speeches and workshops, that true change required radical restructuring of economic systems. While he understood the criticism, he refused to let it deter him. Progress, he believed, wasn't perfect. It was messy, incremental, and often frustratingly slow, but it was still progress. One evening, months after the incident, he found himself sitting on his porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The quiet gave him time to reflect, a luxury he rarely afforded himself these days. As he looked back on everything that had transpired, he realized something profound. This fight wasn't just about justice, it was about humanity, about recognizing that every person, regardless of background or circumstance, deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. He thought about the manager he'd fired that day, the man whose career had unraveled in 9 minutes. While he didn't regret holding him accountable, he hoped the experience had taught him something too. Maybe it forced him to confront his own biases, Maybe it pushed him to grow. Either way, the man believed that accountability wasn't punishment. It was an opportunity for transformation. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he smiled softly to himself. Life had thrown him a curveball that morning at the bank, but instead of dodging it, he'd swung with all his might. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its share of obstacles, he felt ready. Ready to keep fighting, keep advocating, and keep inspiring others to join him. Because this wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, to anyone who had ever faced rejection and risen above it, to anyone who believed in the possibility of a better tomorrow, even when today felt impossibly hard. And so, the man continued forward, one step at a time. Not as a CEO seeking recognition, but as a human being committed to making the world a little kinder, a little fairer, and a lot more hopeful for everyone.